In 1901, a group of Greek sponge divers got caught in a storm and took shelter near a tiny island called Antikythera. When the weather cleared, they went diving anyway, and what they found on the seafloor wasn't treasure. It was a shipwreck over 2,000 years old, and buried inside it was a corroded lump of bronze that archaeologists almost threw away as scrap metal. It sat in a museum drawer for decades before anyone realized what they were actually looking at. And when scientists finally X-rayed it in the 21st century, using technology the original discoverers couldn't have imagined, they found something that should not exist. 30 precisely cut bronze gears interlocking with each other, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking the phases of the moon, and calculating the position of the sun years in advance. An analog computer, built roughly 2,200 years ago, so far ahead of its time that nothing else this sophisticated appears again in the historical record for over 1,000 years. Today, we're going to walk through this and several other genuine, documented, scientifically verified mysteries from the ancient world, artifacts and structures that professional researchers have studied for decades, using every tool modern science has available and still cannot fully explain. This isn't speculation. This is what happens when real evidence refuses to fit the story we've been told about how advanced the ancient world was supposed to be. Let's stay with that device for a moment, because the deeper you look, the stranger it gets. The Antikythera mechanism, as it's now called, contains a level of miniaturized, interlocking gearwork that European clockmakers wouldn't manage to replicate until the 14th century, nearly 1,500 years later. Researchers using modern X-ray tomography have identified inscriptions on the mechanism's surface tiny enough to require magnification just to read, that function essentially as an instruction manual, describing astronomical cycles with an accuracy that implies genuine, tested engineering knowledge, not a lucky one-off invention. And that's exactly what makes this so unsettling to historians. A single, isolated device this advanced doesn't usually appear out of nowhere. Complex technology is normally the product of a tradition, generations of incremental improvement, with earlier and cruder prototypes leading up to it. But no earlier prototypes have ever been found. No later versions either, not for over 1,000 years. It's as if an entire branch of ancient engineering simply vanished, leaving behind exactly one surviving example. By pure accident, at the bottom of the sea. Was this really a one-of-a-kind invention by an isolated genius? Or is it the last surviving fragment of an entire mechanical tradition that we've simply never recovered the rest of? Now travel roughly 1,000 miles east, to the deserts outside Baghdad, and to a discovery that still splits scientists down the middle nearly a century after it was made. In 1938, an Austrian archaeologist working in Iraq uncovered a set of small clay jars, each containing a copper cylinder, an iron rod, and traces of what appeared to be an acidic residue, dated to somewhere between the 3rd century BCE and the 3rd century AD. When assembled, the way researchers believe they were originally intended to be used and filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or grape juice, these objects generate a small but measurable electric current, somewhere around 1 to 2 volts. They've become known, somewhat controversially, as the Baghdad batteries. Mainstream historians push back hard on the idea that these were actually used to generate electricity in any meaningful, intentional way. And it's worth saying clearly that most Egyptologists and archaeologists today believe they were more likely used for something else entirely. Possibly electroplating small objects with a thin layer of gold, or perhaps even serving a completely non-electrical ceremonial purpose we haven't correctly identified yet. But here's what nobody disputes. The physical objects themselves do function as a basic galvanic cell when assembled and filled with an acid. That part has been tested and replicated repeatedly in labs. What nobody can say with total certainty is whether the people who built them understood that and used it deliberately, or stumbled onto a design that happened to work without fully grasping why. If it was intentional, it would mean someone in the ancient world understood the basic principles of electrochemistry, roughly 1,700 years before Alessandro Volta is credited with building the first true battery in 1800. From there, the mysteries only get bigger, literally. Head south to the coastal desert of Peru, and you'll find the Nazca Lines, a series of massive geoglyphs carved into the ground roughly 1,500 to 2,000 years ago by the Nazca culture, some stretching for miles across the arid plateau. There's a hummingbird, a monkey with a spiraled tail, a spider. Dozens of perfectly straight lines running for kilometers without deviation. And here's the detail that makes this genuinely strange rather than just impressive. Most of these figures are so enormous and so precisely proportioned that they are essentially impossible to fully appreciate from ground level. You have to be hundreds of feet in the air to actually see what they are. The Nazca people who created them had no aircraft, no hot air balloons that we have any evidence of, no elevated vantage point anywhere near the site tall enough to view the largest figures in their entirety. So how did they design and execute drawings this large and this precise without ever being able to see the final result themselves? Archaeologists have proposed some genuinely compelling answers, including evidence of simple surveying techniques using stakes, ropes, and small-scale models that could be mathematically scaled up across the desert floor. And that theory has real experimental support behind it. But it still leaves an open question about purpose. Why go through this much effort, generation after generation, to create images that the builders themselves may never have fully seen? The leading theories involve religious rituals tied to water and fertility, walked as ceremonial pathways rather than viewed as pictures. But no theory has been definitively proven, and the debate among archaeologists is still very much alive today. If size is what impresses you, though, nothing in the ancient world quite prepares you for Baalbek in modern-day Lebanon. Built into the foundation of a Roman temple complex are 3 stone blocks known as the trilithon, each measuring around 64 feet long and weighing an estimated 800 tons apiece. To put that in perspective, that's heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 747. And nearby, still sitting half buried in the ancient quarry where it was cut, is an even larger block, nicknamed the Stone of the Pregnant Woman, weighing somewhere around 1,000 tons, that was apparently abandoned mid-transport for reasons nobody has ever been able to determine. Modern engineers have run the numbers on this repeatedly, and the results are consistently uncomfortable. Moving a single stone this heavy, even with modern hydraulic equipment, is a serious logistical operation. Doing it with the tools historians attribute to the era that quarried it, wooden rollers, ropes, and raw manpower, would require a coordinated labor force and engineering precision that stretches the outer edge of what's considered physically plausible. Some researchers argue the blocks were moved using massive teams of oxen or elephants combined with sophisticated log rolling systems, and there is real historical precedent for large-scale stone transport using exactly these methods elsewhere in the ancient world. Others believe the platform actually predates the Romans entirely, and that Roman builders simply inherited and built on top of an already existing foundation constructed by a civilization whose identity and methods have been lost to history. Nobody has definitively settled the argument, and the abandoned 1,000-ton stone sitting in that quarry, half cut and never moved, is left as a permanent physical question mark that nobody has ever been able to fully answer. Cross the Atlantic, and the mystery only intensifies. High in the Peruvian Andes sits Sacsayhuaman, a massive fortress complex built by the Inca, featuring zigzagging stone walls constructed from boulders so large and so heavy that some individual blocks weigh well over 100 tons. What makes these walls almost impossible to look away from isn't just their size, it's their precision. The stones are irregular, multi-sided, oddly shaped polygons, no two exactly alike, and yet they're fitted together so tightly that even today you cannot slide a single sheet of paper into the seams between them. No mortar holds these walls together, just the sheer, mathematically improbable precision of the cut. The Inca had no iron tools, no wheel used for heavy transport, and no written engineering records explaining their exact methods. Yet they somehow quarried, carried, shaped, and interlocked stones this massive with a tolerance that modern stonemasons, using diamond-tipped power tools, still find genuinely difficult to replicate by hand. Some engineers have proposed that the stones were softened using natural acids or plant-based compounds before shaping, a theory that remains unproven and largely rejected by mainstream archaeology, while others argue it simply came down to an extraordinary highly skilled stoneworking tradition, refined over generations, that we've underestimated. Either way, the walls are still standing exactly as they were built, having survived earthquakes that have leveled colonial Spanish buildings constructed centuries later right next door, buildings that used mortar and modern for their time construction techniques, and still couldn't withstand the same tremors that Sacsayhuaman shrugged off without a single stone shifting out of place. Now for something almost nobody has heard of, and which might be the strangest entry on this entire list. In the Zhejiang province of China in 1992, a local villager decided to pump the water out of a series of ponds that locals had always simply called bottomless. What he found underneath wasn't a natural cavern. It was an enormous network of man-made underground caves, now known as the Longyu Caves, featuring soaring ceilings, massive supporting pillars, and walls carved with parallel chisel marks so uniform and evenly spaced that they look almost machine-produced. There are 24 of these caverns discovered so far, some large enough to comfortably fit several hundred people inside, and archaeologists estimate that excavating a project this size, entirely by hand, would have required moving roughly 1 million cubic meters of rock. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. There is no historical record of this project anywhere. Not a single mention in any surviving Chinese text, no matter how far back researchers have searched, describing who built these caves, when they were built, how many workers it required, or, strangest of all, why. No inscriptions have been found explaining their purpose. No tools have been recovered at the site. No records exist of a construction project on this scale happening anywhere in that region at any point in documented history, despite ancient China having one of the most extensive written historical records on Earth. A civilization capable of coordinating a labor project of this magnitude, carving out enough rock to fill hundreds of Olympic swimming pools with the same meticulous, repeated tool pattern across dozens of separate chambers, managed to do so without leaving behind a single written trace of the effort. That's not a small oversight. That's an entire chapter of human history that appears to be simply completely missing. And then there's the mystery that isn't a structure at all, but a book, and it might be the most frustrating unsolved puzzle on this entire list because it's sitting right in front of researchers and they still can't crack it. The Voynich manuscript is a handwritten codex, radiocarbon dated with real confidence to the early 15th century, filled with roughly 240 pages of flowing, elegant script in an alphabet that matches no known language on Earth, alongside detailed illustrations of plants that don't correspond to any identified species, astronomical diagrams, and elaborate illustrations that appear to show human figures bathing in networks of green liquid-filled tubes. For over a century, some of the best cryptographers and linguists in the world have attempted to break it. That includes code breakers from both world wars, professional cryptanalysts from intelligence agencies, and, more recently, artificial intelligence systems specifically trained to detect linguistic patterns. Every single attempt has failed. Statistical analysis of the text does show it behaves like a genuine language, with consistent word-length patterns, letter frequency distributions, and repeated structures that are extremely difficult to fake convincingly, which argues strongly against it being pure gibberish or an elaborate hoax. But nobody has ever definitively translated a single confirmed sentence. Is it an unknown language, an invented one, an elaborate cipher nobody has found the key to, or something else entirely that we don't yet have the framework to even properly categorize? 600 years later, the book is still sitting in Yale's Beinecke Library, fully digitized, freely available for anyone in the world to study, and it remains genuinely and completely unread. Not far from Sacsayhuaman, across the border in Bolivia, sits a site that many researchers consider even harder to explain. Puma Punku, part of the ancient Tiwanaku complex, perched over 12,000 feet above sea level near the shores of Lake Titicaca. What's left of it today is mostly scattered ruins, but the individual blocks that survive are almost unbelievable to look at up close. Massive slabs of andesite and red sandstone, cut with perfectly straight edges, flawless 90-degree interior corners, and repeating geometric patterns, drill holes and grooves so precise and so consistent from block to block that they appear to have been mass-produced from a single template, rather than individually hand-carved the way ancient stonework typically shows small human variations. Andesite is an extremely hard volcanic stone, ranking high on the hardness scale, and cutting it with this level of accuracy using bronze or stone tools, the only technology the Tiwanaku culture is believed to have had access to at the time, is something modern stonemasons have struggled to convincingly replicate even with hardened steel. Radiocarbon dating places construction at the site at roughly 500 to 600 AD, though some researchers, based on disputed astronomical alignment calculations, have argued for a far older date, a claim that mainstream archaeology firmly rejects and considers unsupported by the actual excavation evidence. What isn't disputed is the precision itself. It's sitting there in person, measurable, photographable, and it has never been fully explained how a culture without iron tools or, as far as we know, sophisticated stone-cutting machinery achieved a level of geometric consistency that looks, frankly, industrial. Then there's the mystery that isn't even fully on land. Off the coast of Yonaguni, the westernmost island of Japan, divers in 1986 discovered a massive underwater rock formation sitting roughly 75 feet below the surface, featuring flat terraces, sharp right angles, and what looks unmistakably like a series of carved steps leading up toward a raised platform. Some marine geologists who have examined the site argue the entire structure is a natural formation, the product of sandstone naturally fracturing along its existing bedding planes and joints, a process that can, under the right geological conditions, produce startlingly straight, angular shapes without any human involvement at all. And there are comparable natural rock formations elsewhere in the world that support this explanation. But other researchers who've personally dived and mapped the site, including a marine geologist from the University of the Ryukyus who has studied it for decades, argue that certain features go beyond what natural fracturing alone should produce, including what appear to be deliberately carved holes, a stone feature resembling a face, and pathways that seem too consistently navigable to be pure geological coincidence. If it turns out to be entirely man-made, the implications are enormous because sea levels in that region were roughly this low around 10,000 years ago, meaning the structure, if built by people, would have to predate the pyramids by thousands of years, built by a culture history has no other record of. The debate between the natural formation camp and the man-made camp hasn't been resolved, and short of draining the ocean, it may not be resolved for a very long time. Halfway across the Pacific, on one of the most isolated inhabited islands on the planet, sits a different kind of puzzle, one that's less about how something was carved and more about how it was moved. Easter Island, or Rapa Nui, is home to nearly 900 massive stone statues known as moai, some standing over 30 feet tall and weighing more than 80 tons, carved by the Rapa Nui people between roughly the 13th and 16th centuries. For a long time, the dominant explanation for how these enormous statues traveled miles from the quarry where they were carved to their final ceremonial platforms involved log rollers, requiring the wholesale deforestation of the island's original palm forest, a process some researchers tied directly to the island's later ecological collapse. But local oral tradition always maintained something different, that the statues walked to their positions upright, and for decades that was dismissed as folklore. Then, in 2012, archaeologists Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo actually tested it, using ropes attached to a full-scale replica moai and rocking it forward in a controlled, rhythmic motion, and found that a relatively small team could genuinely walk an upright multi-ton statue across open ground this way, matching wear patterns found on the base of real moai and even damage patterns along the actual transport roads that align with a walking, rocking motion rather than dragging. It's a rare example on this list of a genuine mystery being convincingly solved through careful, testable experimental archaeology. But it hasn't fully closed the case, because the largest unfinished moai, still sitting in the quarry today, weighs an estimated 145 tons, and no one has ever demonstrated, even with the walking method, how a statue of that scale could have realistically been moved at all, leaving open the very real possibility that it was never meant to be moved anywhere, or that Rapa Nui's builders had methods for their biggest work that we still haven't identified. And then there's a map that, depending on who you ask, is either one of the most extraordinary cartographic anomalies in history or a case study in how eagerly people want to believe in lost knowledge. The Piri race map, drawn in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral and cartographer, survives today only as a fragment, but that fragment accurately depicts the coastlines of Europe, West Africa, and South America with real precision for its era, compiled, according to Piri Rice's own notes, from a combination of older source maps, some reportedly dating back to the time of Alexander the Great, that no longer survive today. What's made the map famous, though, is a claim that gained popularity in the 1960s, that the map's southern coastline actually depicts part of Antarctica, centuries before the continent was officially discovered in 1820, and, more controversially, that it appears to show that coastline in a shape resembling its ice-free bedrock, something only mapped using radar and seismic surveys in the 20th century. It's important to be straightforward about where mainstream cartography and geography actually stand on this. The vast majority of professional cartographers and historians who've studied the original map closely reject the Antarctica interpretation, arguing the southern landmass is far more likely a somewhat distorted, error-filled rendering of the South American coastline curving eastward, a common type of mistake in maps compiled from multiple inconsistent sources during that era. The bedrock matching claim in particular has been widely challenged as a case of people seeing a pattern they wanted to find. That pushback deserves to be taken seriously. But what nobody disputes is the map's core mystery, that a 16th century admiral was working from source material, now completely lost, detailed enough to plot coastlines with a level of accuracy that historians still can't fully account for given what we know about the map-making tools and survey techniques available at the time. What's striking, when you step back and look at all of these together, isn't any single mystery on its own. It's the pattern connecting them. A bronze computer with no known ancestor. A battery whose exact purpose is still argued over by the people who study it professionally. Massive drawings built to be seen from a vantage point their creators may never have reached. 1,000-ton stones abandoned mid-transport for reasons nobody recorded. Interlocking walls precise enough to outlast earthquakes that flattened buildings built centuries later with supposedly superior technology. Andesite blocks cut with a geometric consistency that looks factory-made, thousands of years before factories existed. An entire underground excavation project large enough to require moving 1 million cubic meters of stone with zero surviving historical trace of who did it. A rock formation on the ocean floor that scientists still can't agree is natural or man-made. A multi-ton statue whose builders may have known how to make it walk. A map built from source material that no longer exists anywhere on Earth. And a book written in ink that's chemically consistent with its supposed age in a language nobody alive can read. None of this, taken individually, proves the existence of lost advanced civilizations, ancient contact with unknown outside influences, or hidden technology beyond our current understanding. And it's important to be honest about that. Mainstream archaeology has reasonable evidence-based explanations for a lot of what we just covered, even if those explanations aren't always complete or fully agreed upon within the field itself. Extraordinary human ingenuity, applied consistently over long periods of time by skilled, motivated, highly organized people, can genuinely produce results that look impossible in hindsight, especially once the specific knowledge and techniques involved were lost, forgotten, or simply never written down. That's not a cover-up. Sometimes that's just how fragile the historical record actually is. But it's also fair and honest to say that the confidence with which ancient history often gets presented, tidy timelines, clean explanations, single accepted narratives, doesn't always match how much these objects and structures genuinely stump the experts who've devoted entire careers to studying them. Real scientists, using real modern tools, X-ray tomography, radiocarbon dating, structural engineering analysis, computational linguistics, have thrown everything they have at these mysteries, and several of them are still standing completely unresolved. Not because nobody's tried hard enough, because the evidence itself simply hasn't given up its answers yet. So the next time somebody tells you we fully understand what the ancient world was capable of, remember the bronze gears pulled out of a shipwreck by sponge divers who nearly threw them away as scrap. Remember the 1,000-ton stone still sitting exactly where its builders apparently just walked away from it, unfinished, unexplained, and untouched for thousands of years. Remember the underground chambers in China that an entire civilization somehow built and then never once wrote about. History likes to present itself as a finished story, chapter after chapter, fully explained and neatly closed. But every so often the ground gives way, a pond gets drained, a shipwreck gets discovered, and we're reminded that some of the most important chapters were never actually written down at all, and some of them, even now, are still sitting there, waiting to be read.